Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Barkology. Today we've got another exciting guest on the show. We've got Craig Ogilvie here. He's a dog trainer and business mentor. He's founder of Ogilvie Dogs. He's an author. He's also got Ogilvie Dog Centre as well. So busy guy. So hi Craig, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me on. Hey, everyone.
Cool. Okay, so I think for those of you, well, so obviously our listeners are in South Africa as well as in the UK and in Europe and stuff. So do you just want to give a little kind of insight into how you started getting into dogs and dog training to begin with?
Yeah, for sure. I'll try to give you the condensed version. So when I was a little boy, I grew up with my granddad primarily, my mum as well, but my granddad mostly. And my granddad was a police dog handler. So that's how I got into dogs. So I lived with him all of the way up until he passed. And then when I got into sort of my latter teens, I was really interested training the dogs with him as a kid and just obsessed a little bit, really. But I didn't get any legs to do it properly until I started to drive. And I could sort of start to visit places. And I met my first mentor, who was a behaviour consultant in London. I was really fortunate because as I was sort of studying and stuff, he took me under his wing and started to take me with consults, and that's where the wheel started rolling for me. And then I was always really interested in working dogs because of granddad and just sort of fascinated with police dogs, really. And I was really lucky then to meet like my second mentor, who took me to and from France, and I started like training to train dogs in Mondio Ring, which is a sport that consists of like obedience, agility, and then criminal apprehension. So lots of time back and forth from France to the UK, training. Like he used to supply dogs to army and the police and sort of different organizations all over the place. So lots of back and forth from Europe. And then I become like the first person in the UK to license to wear the costume in Mondio Ring competition. So spent lots of time traveling back and forth from Europe. And at the same time, I was still sort of operating behavior consults on a very part-time basis. I was still working a day job at the time, and just spending all of my time traveling back and forth. And like when I was in Europe, the strategy for teaching dogs to bite, a lot of the time people would consider that if a dog just didn't do it immediately, that they weren't good for purpose, and they just end up passing them on and getting a new one, which I really didn't like for obvious reasons. So like I started to really develop an understanding of how to build the dogs to be able to do it, even if they weren't just genetically gifted with it to do so. And it all ties back to the predatory motor pattern, and it's basically a derivation of play. So what I then did was, as I was doing that, I was seeing how I was building confidence in dogs that weren't quite so confident with ring sport, and I started to utilize it with the dogs that I was working with from a behavioral perspective, which produced like a really quick result. Like it was really immediate. I was like, oh Jesus Christ, these people haven't done this before. This is working really well. So I started to like lay out a structure and a little bit of a system into what I did. And then sort of as I was traveling back and forth from Europe, I was also doing, I got picked up to do seminars for the police and the military. And at the same time, I got offered a job as a general purpose police dog training instructor for Wiltshire Constabulary. So I worked for the police for quite some time. At the same time, I wrote the book. I was approached by like a company to write the book. And traveling all around the world, luckily, to do seminars based on interactive play, which is where the play stuff come from, and then had to leave the police because it got so busy, uh, and work primarily with like player motivation stuff, but also dogs in escalated states of arousal, with problem behaviors that are usually correlated with such, which are the two things that I've mostly done. So behavior consults and then sort of play and motivation stuff, and the biting stuff as well. And then sort of as stuff progressed on, I went from, because I was so busy teaching seminars all over the world, I adopted like an online coaching model, whereas I stopped working with people in person from a behavioral perspective and started to coach them. So it was like online work and then still traveling the world doing seminars. And then about 5-ish years ago, I got asked by because a lot of the coaching students were dog trainers needing help with their own dogs. I got asked to help them with their business, and I said, well, yeah, let's give it a go. We'll see how that works, and sort of worked it out, and they did really well really quickly. So I went away and had a good amount of training and sort of founded the mentoring system, and the agency, and that's really taken over since then. In the meantime, also launched the Ogilvie Dogs Training Centre, which is like a unique facility that we've got in Lincolnshire in the UK. So yeah, it's been a bit of a ride. That's the shortest version I can give.
Very, but it sounds all really cool. And I found all the Mondio ring and stuff really exciting and stuff. It sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool.
Mm.
It's cool.
So,
Minus the scars.
Yeah.
yeah. So going to the play, I actually have your book here right in front of me too, all the way in South
I
Africa.
know, I've
Like
also got
young,
it
look
here.
at that young first Craig.
I know, I was looking at earlier, I was like, oh my gosh, I wonder how old you were when you wrote this.
Look like a
It's
baby.
so different
That was in my young 20s.
now.
But yeah, it's exactly like you say, like a lot of pet people specifically, they don't know about play and the importance of play and really also how to develop play, right? So it's not uncommon in South Africa for puppies that like to never have played with their humans before. And like come to
Yeah.
us as adult dogs, sort of, needing to teach those skills. But can you just tell all of our listeners how important play is for dogs and the benefits of play?
Yeah, I think play is massively important in general because if you think about dogs and sort of their genetic lineage, like a lot of dog, well, all dogs have a tie back to the predatory motor pattern, which is basically an outlet for chasing, catching prey. And a lot of the problem behaviors and a lot of the training that you do ties back to the predatory motor pattern. And in actual fact, a good portion of the dogs that I'm used to seeing in the behavioral world, Malinois, Dutch Shepherds, working bred German Shepherds, Border Collies, etc., bull breeds particularly, which I absolutely love. A lot of people are that they sort of demonize letting the dogs bite things because they have
Yeah.
like this conception, which isn't there whatsoever. As I say, Malinois, there's one sleeping on the sofa behind me next to the cat. So it's like a lot of people feel that it's going to present a problem, as we're a lot of the time not giving them an outlet for something that they would do organically, naturally, is the thing that presents the
Mhm.
problem. And then what happens is, I always say, like they've got a little devil on their shoulder, and a lot of people try to suppress him. You'll never suppress him. Like you've got to make friends with him and give him work to do and give him sort of clear guidance. But then you've also got the flip side of the coin. I've worked with a lot of dogs that have got really extensive anxiety issues, foreign rescues. We get a lot of in the UK, and the person will say to me, the dog's at home and just won't leave home whatsoever, and they're trying to counter condition all of the stuff that we would do typically. And, a lot of those dogs aren't into standardized play to begin with. They've not got the confidence to take a bit of food off the kitchen floor. But developing and sort of manipulating a style of play that suits them, you really start to see their independence and confidence come out with. And I think it's also from a reinforcement strategy. People are very relatively close-minded a lot of the time, particularly in the pet world, and it's just due to lack of education. It's not their fault whatsoever. But they're like, oh, reinforcement, positive reinforcement means food, and it's like one little thing. Obviously, like for shaping, teaching mechanical skills, etc., food is really, really important. But it's one aspect of reinforcement that you use. And if you think about, a lot of the dogs that I see in the sports and performance world, they're like, we've got to keep them calm because we don't want to lose them whatsoever. And the dogs are doing things like, oh my God, like, do I have to do this now? You introduce like a little bit of a structured reinforcement protocol revolving around play, and you see an input or an increase of behavior output by like 1,000,000% because the dog's like, oh, I want to do that. And I think a lot of the time people don't realize that the behavior that they're asking the dog to do, the performance of such, is only going to be sort of correlated to the dog's um, genetic time back to do so, or alternatively, the reinforcement that comes afterwards. Because hill work is one of the comparisons I give all of the time. Like if you watch Zen do hill work, it looks like it's the best thing in all of God's earth. It's walking next to you. It really isn't. It's boring. The only reason that it's fun is because the reinforcement that comes off of the back end. And if you look at like all of the fabulous trainers over the world, the behaviors that they get out of their dogs are all due to the degree of reinforcement that comes afterwards. Or if you've got something like agility, there's a lot of intrinsic reinforcement in agility. And if you look at a Sheltie, it's really, really common. Like I see a lot of the German guys run dogs. I'm not an agility person whatsoever, but like, watching or observing. And you see a lot of those guys, the dogs run and they finish, they jump into their arms, and people are like, oh, why aren't they rewarding them? And I'm like, well, the dog is clearly very, very intrinsically reinforced from running. Is it necessary to reward them if they want something else? 100,000%, let's give it to them. But these guys are super dog trainers. They obviously know what they're doing. So I think it's something that's lacking massively. I think it's something that's massively misunderstood. And I think, unfortunately, still, particularly in the pet world and the pet market, there is still this correlation with like dominance and dogs biting things, which, for professionals, we know that's far overlooked. But I think it's still an educational perspective from people in the pet world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I find as well when I don't really teach puppy classes anymore, but my trainers for me do. And like, when we get them to bring toys to class and everything, we find as well like pet people don't really know how to play with dogs as well. And so we have to explain, about the predatory chase sequence and all that, but I find they literally just haven't got a clue about, they just kind of waggle
I
the
think that I
in the
think
dog's
that's
face. And
yeah, I was just about to say that is what you get 90% of people do. They wiggle the
yeah,
toy in the dog's face, and if the
Yeah.
dog bites it, they like to play. But like one of the things that I always draw to, particularly when I'm teaching seminars on different aspects, is there's such a great amount of social pressure in doing that with the wrong type of dog. Like if you wiggle a toy in the face of like a Malinois with good genetic lineage, they're going to bite you in the hand probably. Great, fantastic. Like we're up and away, the dog's going to play with us.
Mhm.
If you've got a dog that's a little bit sensitive or it is developing, it's going through a
Mm.
fear period, if you wiggle a toy in their face, it would be like somebody coming over and like wiggling a cucumber in your face or something. Like
Yeah,
you don't know what to do with it. You're like, oh God, this is really pressuring. Let me get out of here.
yeah.
And that's the part that presents the problem.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And it's really interesting what you said about, like dogs that need to bite, like the Mallies, for example, and people try and teach them to be calm and things. Like I've got one of my friends here, she's got a very high drive dog from like the best lines in the world. She's got a Mallee, and she's trying to calm the dog down using just food and stuff, but she just gets bitten completely in the process because she's just not like, the dog needs to bite, and she's actually so much better when she
Yeah,
does
but it's like
point and
it's
stuff.
like the outlet of biting something gives you the calm and relaxed behavior. And with dogs like that, unfortunately, as much as I think a lot of it is due to sort of pop dog training culture now, because I do a lot of seminars, like it's one of the primary things that I do now based around arousal. And it's like a lot of people demonize the concept of a dog being aroused because in, behavioral literature, which we're all really well studied into, it says, all problem behaviors have a derivative of arousal, which is absolutely 100,000% true. But arousal takes two different concepts. There can be sort of the negative or the undesirable attribute, as well as a positive attribute. Too much of either is a bad thing because it leads to sort of impeded threshold or trigger stacking issues. But a lot of the time, giving the dog the outlet to do so in a structured manner gives you the flip side of the coin. It's like if you take a dog to train and they get to an environment and they're absolutely wild and you're trying to feed them, sniffing, olfaction slows down respiration, circulation, bodily function. It can work really well. For a lot of the working dogs that I work with, I say, right, let's get to the location, ask for a baseline behavior, and then let's play with the dog before we go and work. You get a little bit of steam out of them, and then they're like, right, good to go. Like let's work. But it's the opposite of what a lot of people would advise you to do in fear of the dog impeding their threshold and not being able to listen. But as long as you've got like a good diagnostic sequence into place, as I always call it, so that you've got like a few behaviors that the dog can perform reliably, and their inability to do such would suggest that arousal is starting to become impeded. You've got a really good gauge of how they're feeling, and then you can just manipulate your warm-up process to make sure that you're getting the best out of them.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And how would you start like teaching a person how to play with a dog? So say, for example, if you've got like a client with a dog, they've never had a dog before and they've got, a dog that perhaps is a medium drive dog, so nothing as hectic as like, the herding breeds or anything like that. What would be the first steps for you to suggest to them?
So for me, I always take the approach of asking the person how I can help because I want the concept to fit into their life so that they feel benefit in it. So if somebody comes to me, because you've got to think about the concept of play. A lot of people are like, oh, well, if he doesn't play, it's the end of the world. So it's not the end of the world, we can just get on. So I always say, like, how can I help? And they may say, oh, we struggle with him recalling, for example. And I go, oh, what do you use as reinforcement? Da, 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 da. And then we get to a little bit of a base of the conversation that potentially, the reinforcement that they're using hasn't got enough of a time back to the predatory motor pattern. And I'll say, oh, do you ever play with them? And they say, oh, no, they don't really like it. The next questions for me would then be, do they ever chase anything, prey creatures? Or do they ever bite or destroy anything at home? It's very, very rare that you'll come across a dog, unless you've got one that's, super, super shut down, that hasn't bit, mouthed, destroyed, or done something with an item. And a lot of the time it's like, a bit of vet bed. You get a bit of vet bed out and the dog goes absolutely ballistic because they've been taken away from them because they want to chew it all of the time.
Yeah.
So once I've got an understanding of that, what I would then do is if the person has an understanding already of how to play or of how they do it, I'd always say, oh, show me what you're doing. Let's have a look and then make adjustments from there. But as a rule of thumb, if the dog wasn't interested in play, what I would do to begin with is something that I call the choice to chase test. So I'd always pick sort of a relatively surgical environment. That's one of the big things that people do wrong with play is they go ahead and they try to select an environment that is just way too distracting for the dog. There's lots going on. There's people with like ball chuckers in the distance and stuff, and they're like, oh, we won't play. And it's like, but it's not their fault. They don't understand. So pick a environment like the center with not a lot going on. There's going to be spectators and stuff on a seminar, but I'd create enough space. And then what I would typically do then is what I call the choice to chase test. So I would get a small prey creature type toy, like one of those little roadkill toys, usually with a squeak or something just a little bit abnormal in it. I'm not a big fan of sort of screaming and shouting and using lots of vocalization. The squeak occurs, and what I'm looking for is like that initial sort of auditory response from the dog, like, well, what's that? If I get interested, that I usually throw the toy in the opposite direction of the dog and see if they orientate towards it. A lot of people, like with that, if the dog doesn't go towards it immediately, they're like, oh, they're not interested. As where so often, more times than I can remember, on the third time, the dogs pick the toy up and running around the center with it in their mouth, having a whale of a time. And I always explain to the person then, the reason that I call it the choice to chase test is because the dog, I can't force the dog to chase that. They have to make the decision to do so. And then it gives me sort of a baseline of where they are. The roadkill toy is usually one of those small ones to begin with. If they're not interested in that, then what I would do is always sort of increase the sight of the toy or the visual aspect of it. So I might go for something a little bit fluffy. If they've given me previous information of something the dog likes, I would try an array of different items. Usually 7 to 8 times out of 10, the dog shows interest in one of those. The next thing that I'm looking for then is to build a little bit of elongated chase with it. What a lot of people do is they then pick the toy up and try to play with the dog. And that can work really well with dogs that have got interest. But if you haven't got a dog that's got interest, the social pressure and proximity from the handler can present a problem. So what I would do then is I'd go, right, let's tie an extension on this around about 2 to 2.5 meters long. Let's throw the toy away. And as the dog orientates towards it, let's get some prey creature type motion into it, which usually that's the part where people go, oh, wow, God, that's completely different, because the play isn't necessarily directly attached to the handler to begin with. You're really tapping into that predatory motor pattern aspect to begin with. So the dog chases after it, then they bite onto it. Once they've bitten onto it, what I always talk people through is you want to make sure that the dog has always got the upper hand. So the chase should be challenging for the dog, but achievable. You don't want to whip it away. Like I always say to somebody, if you stand back and forth and whip a toy back and forth like this, even for a large male Malinois and a 2.5 meter bit of string, there to there is at least 2, maybe 3 times the length of the dog's body to get back to it. A Malinois will bite you in the hand. A dog that hasn't got quite so much drive will just lose interest and disengage. So I started to work on like circular chasing patterns so that the dog is able to chase and always feel like it's achievable. As the dog bites it, we then go into like a movement pattern to create tension. Human nature is to grab the toy, bend in at the elbows, and yerk up and down, which most people do. No problem if a dog's got reinforcement. That lots of dogs really like it. But what I tend to stick with to begin with is a lateral movement pattern, whereas a person sort of sways from side to side to keep a nice amount of tension on it. As soon as the dog offers resistance, I always let the toy go slack and either parade with them or start the game again, depending on the dog's grip tenacity. Some dogs need like the dead and activation technique, so that the toy goes dead and you start again, because as soon as it goes dead, they start to mouth it, which starts to lead into the dissect part of the predatory motor pattern. Once we've got sort of the tugging into play, then what I would do is lead the parading into a return. Some dogs, it's really easy to teach to retrieve in that manner. It's not a proper retrieve, it's a toy play retrieve. And I'm very, very big on shaping that. But a lot of the time it's just a little bit too much for the new person to grasp. So what I do is I'll get them running in like a 6x12 pattern. So if they're tugging with the dog here and the dog drops the tension off, rather than running in the opposite direction, because then all you're going to do is end up pulling the dog along, what I do instead is I'll run off to like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. And with the gentle directional change, never pulling, the dog must make the decision to do so. The dog usually goes, oh God, where's mum or dad going? And then starts to parade after them. And with which point, what I would do then is click and start the game again. And usually you get the dog following back with them. And once you've got those sort of concepts into play, I also like, depending on the dog, to teach the release relatively early on and to be able to get a swap between food and the toy as well. Because again, a lot of people are really single-minded. They're either using a toy or they're either using food. And I'm like, food is a really good diagnostic tool at the beginning, not the be-all and end-all. Because if a dog isn't able to take food, it's usually indicative that the dog is again in an escalated state and they're not quite clear enough in their mind, or they don't like the food. But we've got another baseline tool. So I would usually work around the release, whether we're using like a swapping toy method. It would be some type of a swap method, depending on where the dog's at with it. I always like the dogs to be reinforced really well for the release, and I always make sure that the handler understands that. And then once they've got those mechanics, it's just really adjusting for the individual then, because everybody struggles with slightly different things. Timing is the biggest thing, as it is with all dog training. Some people are just gifted with it, which we're very fortunate to do so. But then other people just it's really hard for them, and you've got to break it down into as simple approximations as is possible. And if I can get them to do it, like when I was younger, I would just take the dog and do it, and then like it felt really bad because I'd watch their soul drift away as they couldn't repeat the same thing as I'd done. And I was like, oh yeah, it's great. The dog's doing the thing, but the person isn't so happy. So what I'll do now is I'll do like the hard work until it's just about to work, and then I'll give it to them, and then they feel like they've got it, and then they build confidence and they're able to get into the game, so that like they're able to recreate what you want them to do.
Yeah. And with like what you were saying about the food and the toy swaps and stuff. So like obviously in agility, there's a big thing about like you play with a dog and then you get them on food and then you get them back on toys and stuff again. Is that the kind of
Yeah.
thing you mean? Or
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's like from the world that I come from, from super young in the biting world, like that type of concept wasn't really big, and it was something that I tapped into really quite early because I like the dog to be able to alternate between the two. Because like in the biting world, typically, it's always an ongoing joke for people. They're like, oh, look, I'm offering the dog a bit of steak and there's a decoy in a costume out there and they won't eat the food. For me, all of the puppies that I train, they eat the food. They always eat the food and they're really happy to do so because you build it from a baby. You got that type of problem, but then you've also got dogs that are really food driven and you give them a bit of food and they're like, no, I'm not interested in the toy anymore. And for me, both of those variations are important because like what I always say to people is the concept of play is really important. And we've got to remember that reinforcement drives behavior. It should be our job to manipulate the toy play to the degree that it is reinforcing enough to drive the behavior in the presence of another reinforcer. And if you think about sort of the concept of the more salient stimulus, so to speak, which is the more present or the more attractive stimulus in any one setting, if the food is the more salient stimulus, then all you've really got to try to look and do is potentially decrease the value of said food to begin with and increase the value of toy play to get the manipulation of the both, because food is really important when you're training complex things for continuation markers, disengagement, standby behaviors, etc. And the other thing with using a toy just consistently across the board, it's great, but if anybody's ever been to a workshop of mine, like the dogs and the humans are exhausted in next to no time if they've got no experience with it, and the dog's engines are done. It's like when you're teaching a young biting dog, they get 4, 5 bites in maybe, and it's like, right, let's pop them away, give them a break, let's do another dog now, because the dogs are exhausted. It's completely new to them. So I think it's super important, and what you're saying is exactly right.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I love this. I have a million questions, but going back just a little bit is how can people tell that they're putting too much social pressure on their dogs when they are, trying to play with them?
I think this is down to us as trainers, because a lot of people haven't got a fundamental baseline understanding of what body language looks like, what sort of
Yeah.
what low level displacement behavior looks like, what conflicted behavior looks like. And typically it's super, super subtle, but the person just doesn't understand. And if we think about sort of head turns, lip licks, disengagement, sniffing, scratching, etc., like all of these things, people just don't understand. They think the dog's being a pain in the bum, which is understandable if you don't understand. It's not,
Yeah.
it's like me trying to do complex algebra or something. I wouldn't understand what we're doing. And it's like what you're looking for is the voluntary pursuit of the reinforcer by the animal, because if there isn't a voluntary pursuit of the reinforcer by the animal, it would suggest that it's not reinforcing for the animal. And as a trainer, it's our job to adjust the reinforcer to make sure that it is reinforcing for them. So like one of the big things that I think is lacking across the world in general, I've been very fortunate to teach all over the world, and I think one of the fundamental things that is lacking with pet caregivers is just a fundamental understanding of body language, because sometimes I'm the kindest person in all of God's earth, like teaching. I'm really nice to everybody. I think I'm very well known for that. But I'll say to people, oh, he's really uncomfortable, because, and they're like, they look at you and they're upset because they're like, I never realized that. And I'm thinking, the dog's 3 years old. Why has nobody ever told you this before? Like, and it's for me, it's like, it's ABC type of body language. But again, I never would chastise the person. I'd just say, oh, did you know that ding, 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 this is conflicted behavior. This is what it looks like, etc. And it's like, that's where I think
Yeah.
people misunderstand what's going on. And, it's like seeing into the Matrix, isn't it? When you see it, God, I'm 37 now. I've been training dogs since I was a little boy. Like it's just, you look at it as you two guys do and you go, oh God, that dog's feeling this, and this. I think, again, we can't plug a nodule into his brain and understand exactly how he's feeling, but that's the best data metric that we've got to work off of. And if everybody just had a little bit of an understanding of that, regardless of toy play, I think a lot of
Yeah.
problems would be avoided in the antecedent rather than them escalating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
100%, definitely. I think especially with like, so obviously I kind of do have a lot of agility clients because that's my sport and stuff. And so obviously there's so much online agility training courses now
Yeah.
as well. And with things like play, I think it's very common in agility to like, there's a common thing that you have to be able to tug with your dog and you have to slap them around and all
Yeah.
this. And, I've seen clients do that to like their little gentle Shelties, for example. And then they like get frustrated
Yeah.
because like this Sheltie doesn't want to play with me, but they can't actually read the dog's body language, when the dog's ears don't go back, and even just the dog going back, they can't read it. They just see that like one thing of a trainer trainer playing tug with their dog, and that's how they think that all dogs play. And it's just getting them to understand that every dog is different, and every, you know, like one of my Shelties,
Yeah,
he loves playing tug, you know, whereas a couple of my others perhaps did, you know, they like it more of a distance, for example, you know. So it's yeah, it's just working out what the dog in front of you likes.
I think it's like, I know we laugh about it, because, you know, as you say it, but it's like some dogs really enjoy that tactile aspect. They really enjoy it. And, you know, if you used to go to an obedience club in the 1990s, that's how everybody would play. And, you know, that's sort of very much sort of switched over. It's like, if you think about how the dog actually feels in that moment, it is definitely pretty horrendous. And then people come to me and they're like, oh, the dog won't play. They get a toy out. And if the dog could get out of the building, the dog would get out of the building, because
Yeah.
it's like the worst thing ever. And it's just giving them a fundamental understanding of, you know, the dog should want to engage with the item. And it's like people, isn't it? You know, some people are really tactile driven and like cuddles, and, you know,
Yeah.
when they meet people, other people are like, oh, don't touch me. So it's like, it doesn't mean that it's good or bad, but it's manipulating the play style to suit the individual. Terriers are a really, really good example of this. Like a terrier bites onto a toy. I'm not generalizing, but I am a little bit. But typically, a terrier bites onto a toy. They're very vocal in doing so, and they're really quite aggressive with doing so. But if you look as you sort of edge or test for tactile affection, if you edge your hand towards them, vocalization intensifies. You can see the white of the eyes, and they start to actively avoid the hand. For me, really, really clear indicators that the dog's not quite comfortable. But people will do that because the dog is growling, and they're like, oh, growling's really good for what I want. Other people think growling's really bad. And, you know, it's just understanding what the dog wants to do. And then they let go of the toy, and the dog sort of goes off across the field. And you're like, they're like, oh, I don't understand why he does that. And it's not their fault at all. It's them developing an understanding of what the dog needs and wants, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I remember like when Swift, my border collie, my first border collie as well, when he became a teenager, everything was a bit wonky. And he went through a stage where he didn't like tugging as much. He loved tugging as a puppy. So we'd transfer it to me, you know, sort of chucking the toy, tugging for like a second or two, and then I would chase him and he would chase me, and we would be doing pay bows, and that was how he was rewarded for like going around the cone or something like that. And that was much nicer for him than me sort of trying to force him to tug. And, you know, like I knew he didn't like tugging as much because he would go with the toy to the opposite side of the field and like, you know, just stand there. But in playing this way, he would like come back to me, he'd be having so much fun, and then we could do another rep. So yeah, I just thought that was pretty
That's
cool.
really
And
good
it
dog training,
changes.
though. That's really good dog training, because the problem is that most people haven't got sort of the dexterity to think outside of the box like that. And it's like they go, oh, the dog must do it in this particular way. And it's like, you know, spaniels are a really good example. Anything is trainable, in my opinion. You can train a dog to do anything. And, you know, typically when I train a return, I train the dogs to push the toy back into my hand, and that is very functional. But like a spaniel, you know, 50% of them, a lot of them will win the toy, run back to you, and offer their bum for a fuss. And, you know, when you're working with a pet person, they're like, oh, I want it to push back in my hand. I was like, I can 100% teach him that, no problem. But what are we doing this for? Because what he wants is a bum fuss, and that's only going to increase the strength of the behavior of him returning to you. So it's just like not getting stuck into that dog. Once the dog finds play reinforcing, you can teach him to do a backflip to bring it back if you want to. Like there's no problem. Like the dog, it's super trainable, but it's trying to make sure that they understand that it is a reinforcer, not something that you're training. There's aspects of training involved with it, but fundamentally it is a reinforcer which will strengthen behaviors.
Yeah, definitely. And like what you're saying about spaniels and, you know, the gun dogs, they like to come back and they like to possess and to parade stuff. And I think so many people like the spaniel brings the toy back, and the owner immediately tries to get the toy away from it and throw it again, because they think it's the chase that's actually rewarding. And I'm sure that's why I see so many resource guarding spaniels because they're so like sick of like their owners taking stuff away from them, that actually if like, you know, they just come back and then you allow the dog to do their little trophy run and their, you know, do their little parade and stuff, then I think you end up with a much stronger kind of play and stuff. So it's weird. I've got a new toy Pom. He's like 4.5 months old, and I swear he's got gun dog in him. He's like, he loves just parading stuff in his mouth. Like he just loves carrying stuff around. And I've been able to teach him to retrieve like that really quickly, because I'll throw something and he goes and grabs it and he comes running back and he leaps into my lap and I tell him how wonderful he is and everything. And I've never tried to take it away, but he just loves just holding stuff in his mouth. And so I've made coming back to me super reinforcing for him. And I've not used food, because again, at the moment we're at that stage where if I was to use food, he would lose interest in the toy. So I will work through that. But but I don't necessarily want to use food for it if I don't need to and stuff. But it's just
No,
yeah,
no,
I love just watching their natural behaviors, and then you can just, select, or teach, behaviors you want
what
through
works for them.
what they enjoy doing.
100%.
So
100%.
So yes, yeah, no, it's interesting. And so we had one of the questions from Instagram was someone has she was asking about breed specific play and their needs. So as we've been talking about terriers and spaniels and things, she's got a spaniel cross poodle cross lab, so gun doggy. What would you suggest for a dog of that type?
It depends, to be completely honest with you, because like as much as there are obviously genetic breed traits that we can see in a lot of dogs, like we mentioned Malinois, etc., I really tend to judge the individual because I've met Labradors, for example, that would tug your arm out of their socket, and I've met other Labradors that are really quite soft mouth, and the play has to be manipulated. So like really leading back to what you were saying a minute ago, Chantal, like observing the dog, what they do and what they display in their play when they were holding items and sort of interacting with items, and then just manipulating it to suit the dog. What I'd always say is start off from a soft baseline. So if you think about sort of the sort of predatory pattern, the chasing motion that I worked through earlier, we may find, really quite commonly with a gun dog breed, that when you do that choice to chase test, their first option is to pick it up, run back to you and want to cuddle. If that occurs, reinforce the behavior heavily, give them as cuddlers for as much as they want to. And then what we could potentially look at doing is producing another toy and flicking the other one out. So he goes out. They might go keep the one in their mouth and go and collect the other one as well and bring it back to you. No problem whatsoever. It's only the starting point. And once we've got that, what we can then do is go, okay, so, do they like a little bit of tugging? Should we put a little bit of an extension on one of these toys so that when they bring it back, they've got a little bit of string that we can just see if they want a little bit of tugging. If they do a little bit of tug, let them win, see if they still come along and return. So it's really just like feeling the process out, observing the dog in what they do on a day-to-day basis, and then making the manipulation based on the individual's needs. Again, as we've been saying, that's super, super important. But I think it's still, you've obviously got genetic consistency, but you've also got like genetic variance as well. And there's so many like Malinois that I'm used to are ring sport bred Malinois. Like they're a complete different kettle of fish. Like I see Malinois now that are very border collie-ish in their behavior, very, very border collie-ish. Like they do lots and lots of collie type behaviors, and that's inevitably because selective breeding has occurred, and what people have done is bred them further and further to do, and like there's lots of agility Malinois. They're far different to ring sport Malinois, etc., etc. So I always say just look at the dog in front of you and adjust little by little. One of the best tips I could give the person though is when they trial that process, poke a tripod out with your phone and record the session in sort of 60 to 90-second snippets, have a break, go back and look at it, because you will see the whole picture when you're looking from the outside in, as where a lot of the time when you try to reference back through your own fault patterns, things start to become shaded. You're not like quite so sure if that did happen, what happened, why did it happen, and reviewing the sessions like that will work really, really well.
Yeah, I think video is a really good way just to see what you're doing and what the dog is doing, because you don't realize what you're doing at the time and you're not necessarily reading your dog at the time. So it's
no.
Yeah.
And we all have patterns that we follow as well. Like everybody does things repetitively and they realize it. It's always the case.
Definitely. Yeah. And you swear blind you're not doing them, but then you look at the video and you're like,
no, you are.
I definitely don't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we have another question as well, is how long would you reward a dog with play?
Excellent question. That's a really good one. So it depends on the outcome and what you're reinforcing for. What I always say is play. If you should be putting enough in so the dog finds it reinforcing, which is usually relatively sort of energy exerting for both the dog and the handler, depending on where you're at. If you've got an adult dog and you're all of the way through the loop, you can be sort of relatively effective with your energy output. If you're in a training session, I usually find somewhere between the remit of 15 to 30 seconds fits a nice chunk of play in, not decreasing from the dog's energy bucket too much to go back and do more training. But if you're out and you see a deer and you call the dog back and they recall to you, like you can jackpot for a minute if you want. Like, but what I would always say is don't let quality of the play decrease, make sure that they're getting value for money, the
Yeah.
dog, with the time that you spend with them. I'd much rather a 15-second amazing play session than, 30 seconds where the handler starts to get tired, the dog starts to disengage, and then decides that, moving across the field with the toy in their mouth is better. So
Yeah.
it's again based
Yeah.
on the circumstances and the individual. And then if you've got like a dog that's developing in play, it could even be shorter. You could do, short 7, 8, 9, 10-second games, get the toy out and let's go again. And then you start to work in sort of little reps. But the way that I always compare it is, from my perspective, play should be considered like hit sessions of exercise rather than like middle distance runs or longer duration marathons,
Yeah.
like short, sharp, really reinforcing activities that the
Yeah.
dog absolutely adores rather than longer durations.
Yeah. Yeah. And would you
Yeah.
always end the game whilst the dog is still really enjoying themselves? Or
100%, yeah, I'd rather stop earlier. Like, definitely would rather stop earlier whilst the dog is still engaged, depending on the degree and sort of the behavior output or markers of the dog as an individual. If you've got like, say you've got a little spaniel that's quite foodie and tends to disengage early on, like I'd be not against doing 8-second play sessions with them, and even when they release the toy, whipping it away, popping it back in your pocket, and then finishing so that they're a little bit more excited for it. If you've got a dog that is a little bit more interested in the toy, we could follow a calmer release mechanism, but you still want to make sure that they're finishing the game when they're still interested. But for those dogs, what you typically need is an alternatively reinforcing behavior at the back end to mitigate any likelihood of problem behaviors, jumping up, trying to get the toy, etc., etc., etc. Because for those dogs, the disengage just as important as the engagement.
yeah, makes sense.
Ooh, I actually just thought of something else. So actually on Facebook groups recently, we've been seeing a lot of people, they would train with play sort of, as a reward. And after they stop, the dogs would start humping them. Is there anything that
Yep.
you would sort of say to these people? What can they do?
Yeah, so it depends on, like, what I always try to think about when people are working around any type of problem behavior is gauging the antecedent that is occurring, because pretty typically there'll be a relatively concise, clear antecedent pattern that leads to the humping occurring. So the first thing you've got to think about from my perspective is programming and the duration of time that you're exposing the dog to the reinforcer, because that's going to influence arousal. It can be a learned behavior that the dog gets into really regularly, but it's usually indicative of an elevated state of arousal. So they may be playing too long. That's the first thing to consider. But then also what you've got to try to do to catch that behavior in the antecedent pattern is give the dog a clear alternative for release, an alternative behavior mechanism when they're finished. So like the release is really heavily reinforcing, and then you've got an alternative behavior that's reinforcing but incompatible with humping at the back end. One of the things that works really, really well for that, which I use all of the time, is a moving middle rather than a sitting middle. Because if you think about just having a dog in a standard middle, it would be relatively easy for them to hook the inside of your leg and start humping. As where if you get a release, jackpot reward, middle, and then start to move with them, you'd have to teach that behavior in isolation, of course. It usually gives you a clear alternative that doesn't lead to the dog doing or engaging in the humping behavior. So it's just making sure that the person understands the antecedent pattern and not trying to avoid as much as they possibly can do getting into a load of conflict with the dog over it, because typically with that manner of thing, pushing the dog off, grabbing hold of the dog, which sometimes people feel is completely unavoidable, it just makes the game even better for the dog, and it starts to present more of a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. You saying about humping, actually. So Spirit, my male border collie, he will try and hump me if I don't send him to a toy or something. If I do like any tricks or conditioning type stuff with him, for some reason that just sends him completely over the edge, and like you see his eyes just go wide and he starts panting and then he starts pawing at my leg after the session. So I literally like have to just tell him like go get a toy, and then we tug and stuff, and then that seems to alleviate his
That's that's an alternative behavior. Like I call those behaviors standby behaviors.
Yeah.
So like during the course of a training session, it's always like engagement. Standby for me means we're going to do something in a minute. Stand by. You'll be reinforced for that, and I'll sort of continuation mark and reward them. And then we're going to do something else. Because I always say, like, a lot of problem behaviors occur in grey space when the dog doesn't quite understand or isn't quite in the direction that they need to. So if you can, to the degree that is possible, clear up the grey space where the problem behaviors occur, usually you get like that dissipation of the problem behaviors overall.
No, definitely. And like, do you have like different rules in place for play depending on the type of dog or the drive of the dog that you are training. So say for example with like so say with my toy pom, for example, because I want to keep his toy drive up and like encourage it, like, and because he's only a pom and he's tiny, like I let him do stuff that I wouldn't necessarily let my huge border collie that tugs like a Mallee, for example.
Yeah,
Like, you know,
yeah.
so if he wants to like tug on my sleeve and stuff, like I let him, and I let my Shelties do that as well, because I wanted to, when they were young, because I wanted to encourage that toy drive. As they with Spirit, I wouldn't have done that because he tugs like an absolute Mallee, you know. And so like, do you have like different rules in play? Because I know as well with things like Mallees, like a lot
Yeah,
of my friends here, they struggle with getting their Mallees to drop, like on cue, for example, you know, because they
yeah.
like to just keep hold of the item and stuff. So yeah, so do you have different rules depending on the dog that you're working with?
I mean, I always base things very much individually on like the dog. So, but then there's always adjustments with inside of the rules. For me, I always try to avoid, particularly with pet caregivers, you're massively experienced, you know exactly what you're doing, and you saying that, I can just go, yeah, great, right, really good dog training. If you know, Jane said to me, I've got my first dog, even if it's a Pom or a Jack Russell, and I'm teaching it to bite my jumper,
Yeah,
I'd be
no.
like, oh,
Yeah, no, I'm not
you've definitely
advising
not got
people to do
clarity.
this, but yeah.
No, no, no. I know you're not. What I'm saying is, like, for
Yeah.
you, definitely good dog training. For somebody else, I'd be like, oh God, that won't quite work so well. So for like my puppies, like all of the dogs that I have are like Malinois, and back in the older days, like working bred German Shepherds. For me, I always have like a skin contact rule, which means the party stops. So if the skin contact happens, like the party just stops immediately, and I try to make that relatively clear. The release for me, as a foundation behavior, I teach my puppies to retrieve and release, usually as some of the first behaviors that we do. Again, in exactly the same manner as we've just talked through. But they're two important behaviors for the type of dog that I have, because I don't want conflict with them later along the line. The release for me should be a joy for the dog to do, because I know they're going to be reinforced for it. And that's been the case for all of the dogs that I've had. Some of sort of the baseline things I always try to think about, particularly with bigger dogs or dogs that are a little bit more increased in drive, I always try to put into place like a red light, green light system. So green light is when I give your sort of reward specific marker to access the toy. Red light is when I'm either holding the toy up above waistline or I haven't given the marker. So it's like depending on the degree of the person I'm working with. So if you've got a normal pet person, I would just say red light is toys up above waistline. Green light is marker and produce the toy below waistline. When it hits the floor, it's accessible after the marker. So like those are some of the things that I really try to consider with the release overall. Like from my perspective, I find a lot of people completely sort of misconstrue the dog's desire to release and the dog's motivation to play. And it's like it's really common in the biting world. You know, people will be like, God, when I used to do consultations and sessions all the time, you'd get puppies that are like 6 months old and they've just made them into raving lunatics, and they're like, they won't let go. And I'm like, I
Yeah.
wonder why. They've,
Mm.
they've, they've never sort of given them the option to let go. And it's just like, for me, I break the release down so that it's the same as any other behavior. I decrease arousal, I prime whatever word I'm going to use, usually with high value food. I use a really low level toy, and I just work my way through the process so the dog completely understands the concept and that there's going to be reinforcement, and then just incrementally increase arousal. So the release is massively important. Skin contact is something that I always really, really consider with people, particularly when working with pet caregivers. And then also sort of a red light, green light system as to when the toy is accessible and when the toy is not accessible. And one of the other things that I also like, along with that red light, green light system, is like a starting sequence and a finishing sequence, so that you've not got people with toys in their pockets and dogs sort of jump in and trying to nose butt and get toys out of waistcoats and stuff. So those are some of the things I consider. But then, it's like with Spitzes, like we've got Spitz, and I know they are very tactile driven in general as a breed, and I've taught God hundreds, if not thousands, of them to play. And usually the people that have brought the dogs along to me, they're like they won't play, and they're very tactile driven. You know what they're like? Like they want to play and they want to jump up and sort of. So what I'll do then is I'll like, do you mind me trying something? I'm really certain it's going to work. And what I'll do is I'll get on the floor with them. I'll give them a little bit of tactile and I'll push them away, and then they come back into me, and then their mouth starts to open. Then I'll produce a door into chase. But to instruct somebody to do that would be very, very challenging. And I wouldn't feel super confident doing so unless I was working with them on a day-to-day basis. And I could send them videos and stuff like I would do if I was working with them, because it could just as easily turn into, the dog would be doing it in play, but it could just as easily turn into a problem behavior with the dog
Yeah.
targeting a hand or something. So it's just like the rules are those rules that I've sort of talked through are adaptable, of course, based on the individual, but those are usually the things that are going to sort of coordinate handler safety and dog safety to make sure that there's no problem in the long term,
Yeah. Yeah, no, makes
Yeah.
sense, definitely.
And then how would you teach a review for your a release for your typical high drive dogs?
Yeah, so I always give the comparison. Like usually a couple of times a year, I do CPD for the military or the police, and a lot of the dogs have got a lot of experience biting. So, and it's like the way that I would do it. So they'll usually say, "Oh, Craig, I've got a real problem with this dog letting go, etc., etc." And like the last thing I'm going to do is put a costume on and go, "Right, let's see if we can get them off," because we will be there for the rest of the day trying to, until the dog gets tired. So what I always do in that set of circumstances is as a rule of thumb, I try to pick a reinforcer, a food one, that was high enough that the dog is really driven and motivated for it, cocktail sausage, meat, or something similar. I'd start off with no toys whatsoever, and I would, like, the word that I usually use for releasing is loss, so it'd be loss, sweetie, loss, sweetie, loss, sweetie, loss, sweetie. Basically, just conditioning a secondary reinforcer in the same manner as you would do.
Yeah.
What I would do is I would say loss. The dog collects the food off of the floor. I would give the loss cue, and as the dog turns its head back to me, I'd click the action of the dog turning its head. Once I've got a few repetitions of that, I'd usually get like a boring rubber ring or a bit of hose pipe. I'd place it on the floor. As the dog orientates down towards it, I'd say loss. The dog orientates back towards me. I click and reward. And then what I would do is work my way towards either activating the toy or letting the dog collect it, depending on their preference. Loss, mark and reward. What we're marking now once they've bitten it is not only the orientation, but the opening of the mouth. One of the tricks there is to make sure that you mark the initial movement of the mouth rather than it being the full release, because you're marking an approximations as you would do with a shape.
Yeah.
And then I just build intensity onto it and sort of build the tuggy up, and then I would transfer over items. And with some of the military dogs, certainly you go from a dog that can't release at all to a dog letting go of a cushion or a sleeve in like a 20-minute session, maybe like a 25-minute session, really quite happily so. The only thing I always do is when you're transferring over the reward ratio. So if the dog was going to bite like a tuggy toy, I would typically use a reinforcer that was toy derived for the dog to let go, so that you've got some clarity that the reward is going to be there, and just making sure the dog understands that there's going to be a fair exchange in the sequence, which works really, really well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And then you can also use the swapping method in the same method,
Yeah.
like with like toy swaps in exactly the same pattern. The reason that I like them and I've used them massively, the reason that I would always go for the food option is because it's a little bit more clinical and it's easier for people to grasp. As where, like, I've taught people toy swaps on seminars because that's what the dogs needed, and they've come back like 2 months later. The dog's letting go lovely, but they still need sort of the antecedent influence of the toy presence, because I've not been able to help them consistently. They've not been able
Yeah.
to fade it out. I always like to be able to fade out the use of sort of visual aids and stuff as early on in the process as is possible, so that the dog is actually performing the behavior just like if you were shaping something.
Yeah, yeah. One of my clients, she's quite old now, but she used to be a working dog. I think she was a bomb sniffer dog. Came from
Mhm.
the Netherlands. She worked in Somalia and Kenya and I don't know where else. She's traveled all over Africa, and now
Mhm.
she is living in the best home. She still does quite a lot, but she's retired now,
Mhm.
and she was trained on tennis balls.
Mhm.
So tennis balls are very high value. They used to have to put the tennis balls in the fridge because it wouldn't work putting it on the fridge or in the cupboard or something like that.
Oh no,
And
crashes. Forget them.
yeah. But anyway, this method was the only one that really sort of helped her to, release the tennis ball
Yeah.
when we're doing training.
Yeah, I think it's so super important. It's like a lot of the time people feel like it's just the norm for the dogs not to let go, and like that it's going
Yeah.
to repeat the pattern. And I can see it impeding with a dog that's very food driven. And like if you've got a dog that's like you were saying, Chantel, with your pup, and you don't want to spoil it, like you're doing the right thing, I'd let the dog have the toy, like reinforce it. And at some
Yeah.
point, you'll go, now's the time. You'll know when that is to introduce food into the mix with them. But a lot of the time, with it, it's like with Malinois, like they're bred to bite things. Like that's what they're
He's
bred
a
to do. Like
Mally.
the biting thing is the
Yeah.
last thing from my perspective. How they bite is a different thing. If you're going to train a dog for working purposes or competition, they need to bite in a particular way, which is a different kettle of fish. But the dog biting a toy, unless they're showing some type of outstanding sort of inability to do so, it's typically not going to be a problem. And people, I think, tend to put so much focus into getting them to do it, and then I've spent like all of my adult life fixing the problems that come off of the back end of it,
Yeah.
with like dogs being too aroused, dogs biting them when they take it away, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. I think dog training here in South Africa as well is quite behind like the UK
Yeah, very.
and that kind of thing. And so like I do search and rescue with my dogs as well, and I see some of the Mallies there that haven't been taught to drop things on cue, and they're literally like being choked or having their nostrils blown into or something to like release the toy. It's just like, it's crazy. I just like, this could be so simple, but it's
It creates conflict soup. And again, though, like I'm always like, a lot of people, if they don't understand, it's like it's not to be held against them, really. Like I'm really big on that. If somebody just doesn't understand what to do, it's like, well, you can do this. It's like when I worked for the police, like what I would do a lot of the time was new, and I'd always say, well, why don't we try this? Get the guys to do it, and as soon as it worked, reinforce them massively, and then you've converted somebody. Oh, Jesus Christ, you can do it like that. Wow, I didn't know that. As long as
yeah.
they experience it. So it's like, yeah, a lot of people just get conflicted with their understanding of such, I think.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
definitely. And how would you like introduce play with, say, like a dog that is completely shut down? Like, say, like, you know, like in the UK, you get a lot of Romanian rescue dogs, for example, and a lot of them
Yeah.
just are so shut down. Like, how would you kind of start that process?
So what I'm looking for is like initially with a dog like that, I want to try to develop an understanding of what the dog's like on a day-to-day basis, you know, their environmental preferences. Are they showing sort of plasticity or normal behavior in any type of environment? What I'm looking for is the best possible baseline situation. Stereotypically, in those sets of circumstances, the dog will be in a position in which they're not going to be quite happy to bite or let go to sort of, they may destroy stuff, which we can sometimes use, but typically not enough confidence to do so sustainably. And sometimes a destruction isn't it isn't like an enrichment outlet. Usually it's a sign of stress in a set of circumstances. So what I typically do there is I would actually come away from toys to begin with and try to build some type of sustainable chasing, usually using food or a denominator that the dog is interested, just so that we build a little bit of confidence in sort of the orientation or the chasing part. And then it depends on where it goes then. What I would do there is I'd sort of develop that ability to do so. And what I want is loose fluid behavior markers with the dog voluntarily engaging in it. The easiest next step would be to introduce a food derived toy. Like in the UK, we've got a company called Paws Trading that make these like really, really good like rabbit skin paws pockets. And that is my go-to for dogs that are struggling with play, because the rabbit skin is very easy to bite and destroy, which sort of triggers the biting behavior, which is what we're looking for. And then it's also, you can shape the opening of the toy, which again, for some dogs, depending on how shut they are down, you might have to use a donut, which is basically just like if you think about a tea towel folded back on each other and taped together and just putting the food in the slot, the dog's able to sort of get their nose in. The problem is with paws pockets for dogs that are super sensitive is they've got Velcro on them. A lot of the time you have to run a Stanley knife over them to soften the Velcro and then put them through the washing machine a couple of times. But I would shape the process of accessing the food and then start to sort of generalize them to them chasing it, opening it up and getting the food. And then I would start to follow the same pattern as we talked about before, whereas you sort of attach an extension and then start to get them moving, engaging the biting. For some of those dogs, the actual biting part doesn't come soon, but what you do get is a massive change in behavior off of the back end of them working with the toy and being reinforced. And then you'd look to generalize that concept. The biting usually happens as the dog's got a little bit more space and fluidity to chase, because if you're in like a kitchen or something, sometimes you can find with a dog like that, the dexterity or the ability to chase is limited because of the space that the person's who've got. Not that you need like a huge amount of space. It's just a case of making sure that you've got enough so that the dog can develop the ability to bite. So those would be some of the stepping stones I want. But I'd really want the dog to be able to chase the toy like you would see like that Malinois chase a ball across the field. You want that type of tenacity involved in the game, which will then really help build their confidence. And to be honest with you, from a welfare perspective and a reinforcement perspective, a lot of the time that is more than enough for the dog to build confidence and show like a visible change in behavior. On workshops, I had some dogs come in and it's been touch and go. For me, I'm like a 5-minute plasticity person on a workshop. Like if I can't, as long as the behavior markers aren't too elevated, if I can't sort of produce some type of a visible change in behavior in 5 minutes, I just say to the person, and I've had to do that like 3 times in my whole life, but I'd always say, like, this is an unsuitable learning environment for this dog. Let me give you a refund and I'll give you a free month of coaching so that we can work it through. But like if I can get that initial bit in, you see the dogs change. Like their behavior is much looser, they're more fluid, they're aware of the environment, but less sort of hyper vigilant, and it works so well. But it's a process, and the person sort of has to invest in the steps that they're going to put into place.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And when you're doing like say behavior work and stuff with dogs, would you use toys over food? So say with things like reactivity and that kind of stuff. Do you find that if the dog is more toy motivated, would you rather use toys as opposed to food? Or again, is it dog
Mhm.
dependent and mixture?
It very much depends. The problem is with the toy, I always say to people, with the right dog, you can take them to the devil's door with a toy in their mouth and they won't realize.
Yeah.
And that is an effective dog training. It's basically management facilitation. I'd rather do that than a dog be in a position in which they're uncomfortable. But
Yeah.
I tend to work on sort of a foundation of like pre-max style behaviors where the dog engages in the environment. Operant behaviors. I'm very, very big on operant foundations, which I think something is massively overlooked sort of in 2024 with dog training. I think a lot of people just expect the dogs to work it out, and sort of giving them operant guidance, I think, is super important. And then using toy play intermittently. Like I always use the comparison when working with behavior cases that, 90% of people are trying to teach their dog to shoot in a gunfight. So like they're trying to get the dog to adapt a high level set of skills in an extremely stressful situation, and adding a really arousing catalyst to that. That's never the right thing to do. And adding a really reinforcing catalyst to that escalates arousal isn't always the best
Yeah.
thing to do. It works fantastically as a reinforcement strategy, but the dog needs sort of a baseline understanding of what I would call operant foundations before you do
Yeah.
so. And there has to be some structure to it, because the problem is like people, it works 100%, but sometimes it works
Yeah.
too well. And then the person's just like, oh, every time something is about to happen, I'll just play with the dog. And if you was to look at the dog sort of very analytically, they wouldn't have necessarily made progress. That
Yeah.
they would just be engaging the reinforcer before they noticed what was going on, which is much better than them being stressed, but not necessarily, active behavior modification.
Mm, mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Does that make sense?
And
No,
then
100%. Yeah, definitely. I've played like the look at that, like stuff like the look at that game and that kind of thing before with like my colleagues, and
yeah.
I've kind of let them look. And then I've say with Spirit, he's very, very toy driven. Like especially
Yeah.
outside, he finds toys or the playing more reinforcing than food and stuff. And I found with him, so over lockdown, he was quite reactive. He was like adolescent then. And like here in South Africa, we had a lockdown for like 3 months where we weren't allowed off our properties for like months. So he came out just wanting to like bark and lunge and just kind of kill everything
Yeah.
because he was just so stressed with everything. And I definitely found that
Mm.
using toys, I had to do a lot less reps. So say with the look at that game, for example,
Yeah.
like engage, disengage, like I'd let him see something and then we'd play tug. And I found within like 2 reps or so, he was then like, oh, cool, there's that person over there. It's fine. Whereas say if I was
Yeah.
using food, it would take him a lot longer, and he'd be a lot mouthier
Yeah.
with the food as well because and he just wouldn't find it as so yeah, so that was my question basically, like
Yeah, and it's like it's what you've done. Like it's always gauging the baseline with regards to the dog's
Mhm.
understanding of the skill. And then if the dog
Yeah.
understands sort of the operant platform, then introducing toy play as and when is needed, and then just making sure that we've got sort of the ability to fade it out if is needed progressively, and making sure that the dog is
Yeah.
able to, happily engage in the behavior in situations that escalate, which is exactly what you've done. It's just a lot of, again, you're massively experienced, you know exactly what you're doing. With a
Yeah.
lot of people, it's like they'll
yeah,
see
it's
the
mechanics.
right, that works, that's it, that's all we do. And then
Different.
you've got people,
Yeah,
it's like agility competitions, you see them all the time, don't you? See dogs biting onto toys, like being dragged past things, and I'm like, Jesus God, like turn
Yeah.
your brain off.
Yeah.
Because you see like 20 of them every time you're there.
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then I've also heard, this is also weird to me. I'd never thought of this myself, and I do understand, obviously dependent on the situation. But some trainers here, and it is actually quite popular, say that you shouldn't leave toys free in the house. So what is your opinion
Mhm.
on this?
That's what I was brought up on when I was younger. Like
Yeah.
obviously, because things have changed there. We've got a massive toy bucket in our house, and like all of the dogs have free
Yeah.
access to them. However, what I would say, my main process with this is if you've got a dog that is likely to be exposed to a toy in which they're going to start to engage in problematic behaviors, usually destruction,
Yeah.
I would keep the toys that you play with during your training sessions for you and them to share during training sessions,
Yeah.
and have them free access to other toys that don't sort of start to build a problem. Because a lot of people will say, oh, we've got lots of fluffy type toys like this at home. And when I let my dog win the toy, he defluffs it. And I go, oh, what does he do with the toys at home? Oh, defluffs them. And it's like he's got, an insurmountable amount of learning through with defluffing the toy at home, if you're using the same toy in a play session, as soon as you let him go, his reinforcer is going to be to defluff it. So
Yeah.
if you've got dogs that are really destructive, like I'd always say, give them toys that are a little bit sort of chewy or enrichment orientated at home, so that you're not getting into that pattern of them, you know, destroying things actively that are related to toy play. But I always say to people, if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. Like I'm never like any hard set with you must do this or you must do that. If you, again, likewise, if you've got a puppy that picks up a toy and just does hoolies around the house all of the time, and that's then portraying into training, then it might be favorable to think about the style of toy that you give them access to at home and the type of engagement that they have at home, because that will almost certainly bleed over into training if it starts to become a game. But if they're doing hoolies and running back and forth with you, or zoomies and running back and forth with you, great, no problem whatsoever. So it's always like, I'm super open-minded and adaptable based on the individual. And it's, I think a lot of the time in dog training in general, any hard set yes or no's or rules, so to speak, are usually where progress stops. Like all of the greatest progress I've always made has just been outside of the box and within a creative bubble that people usually wouldn't sort of extend into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And do you do like any personal play with dogs, or do you always use like items like toys and things?
Yeah, I do personal play. And what I always try to give people an understanding of is sort of the bridging point in which the dog engages in the behavior that they typically would do with another dog, which is usually mouthing escalating to the degree that a human would probably be uncomfortable with. So if you watch like two dogs play and the mouthing that they occur, it's usually soft and there's bite inhibition in play. But if they bit you like that, you'd certainly feel it and it would start to present a problem. What I always try to get people to work on when they're doing that is making sure that they understand the dog's point in which they need a sustainable outlet and something to hold on to. And then typically what I would do is not necessarily play with them with the toy in their mouth, but give them a dummy, basically like a nursing aid, so that they can play with them. They can have a little bit of gentle contact with the toy and it doesn't build into bite. And it's always I always lean on sort of the safety first type of aspect for people and making sure that we don't get, and again, I'm in the position in which all of the dogs that come to me have got like real solid third world problems, as I would always say, like they've got problems that are beyond what the average dog would have. So it's always trying to make sure that you're mitigating any potential problems, but also giving them all of their access. And it's only the mouth contact that really becomes the thing. And again, it's a completely normal behavior to do. Once a dog has really good bite inhibition and you've worked your way through the process of, the teeth and skin thing, as we talked about earlier, it's possible to develop like really, really good interpersonal play. But unfortunately, in just the same manner as it is with toy play, a lot of the time people put so much sort of inadvertent social pressure on the dogs and it doesn't go in quite the direction that they'd want to. And what I always try to do with toy play as well is introduce a variation of sort of interpersonal play in that same manner, so that you're using the same type of tactile contact that you would do as part of toy play, and then you've got the bridge between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And then we always end off with the question of, if you had to recommend 3 things or mention 3 things, or any 3 things that people can do to make their dogs happy. So anything, open-ended.
So what I would say is, first of all, evaluate your dog as an individual and look at the things that they like to do on a day-to-day basis and try to incorporate those into the dog's reinforcement structures. So rather than it being, there will be 3 individual aspects in that for every dog, but rather than it being do this, this, and this, what I would always say is evaluate the dog as an individual, rather than following the dogmatic process of, we should do this because we think our dog will like it. Actually evaluate the dog on a day-to-day basis. Really look at the things that they like to engage in. Like, if you've got a dachshund, the person may be like, oh God, they're digging trenches in the back garden, I despise it. Make them a sandpit, bury bones in it. Like let them have a good time with it. If the dogs are destroying your tea towels in the living room, play with them. If the dogs like to run wildly, give them access to a location that is safe for them to do so. If dogs like tactile affection, give them tactile affection. So I think, again, it's not, obviously dogs need all of their given requirements. They need exercise, they need good food, they need shelter. That's completely obvious for everybody. Every dog needs that. But if you think about really sort of making your dogs happy and reinforcing them, that's always the way that I would go about. And you'll find more than 3 things in there, definitely 100%, if you spend a day evaluating your dog and really looking at the things that they like to do. And a lot of those things are usually bedded in problem behaviors, or what people consider as problem behaviors.
Yeah. No, definitely, definitely.
That's not three particular points, but it answers the question, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely. No, it's really important, really, really important. So yeah, I don't think enough people do that. Like, you know, really
No,
feed their dog.
no.
So you give them what their dog really loves to do and stuff. So yeah, super important. Thank you.
Yeah, 'cause it's so different, isn't it? It's so different for every dog, and I think everybody knows, what their dog's basic needs are. As we sort of
Yeah.
talk about exercise, food, shelter, water.
Yeah.
But it's like if you can you really sort of tailor your dog's day to suit them, and humans are individual.
Yeah.
My day is not going to be to the favor of like 90% of human population. Your day is not going to be to favor of 90%. It's depending on the individual, isn't it? Massively.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your time.
Well,
Where can people find out more about you if they want to?
just Instagram probably the easiest place. It's Craig at Ogilvie Dogs on Instagram. The website is ogilviedogs.com. Those are the two best places to get in contact with me. So if anybody's got any questions or anything, feel free to drop me a DM
Okay.
on Instagram, and I'll always take the time to come back to you.
Thank you so much. We'll put that in the show as well. So yeah, but thank you so much. We really
Cool.
appreciate your time. It's been great chatting to you.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys.